visible through the haze of dawn. What to do, what to do? Belatedly, he thought about his shadows. Saint, Fiend, Nightmare, they could help him a lot in this battle. Especially Saint, who was immune to all mind attacks and could resist the authority of the Dread Lord. But thinking about them filled him with endless fury. No one was allowed to steal his vengeance from him, no one. Summoning the shadows would only give them a chance to kill the odious dragon before he could. He would never allow that to happen. This is madness. A feeble thought was drowned by the torrent of bloodlust and demented anger. Sunny was not going to allow anyone to steal his victims. No, if he summoned the shadows, it would only be to kill them. Kill them all. In fact, it was exactly what he should have done. Each of them was a shadow creature, and a powerful one at that, suitable to become fuel for his soul. He had painstakingly nurtured them himself, after all. So, wasn't it only right for him to reap what he had sown? Just imagining the flood of shadow fragments he would receive from slaughtering his servants made Sunny smile viciously. Was that how the Mad Prince had become a titan? It had to be. Where else would the vile madman find enough fragments to form the seventh core, here in the tomb of Ariel? Sunny would be wise to follow his example. But first, he had to kill the dragon. And the traitorous fly. Turning his head to look at his enemies, Sunny lingered for a split second. Out there, far away, wasn't something strange happening in twilight? Suddenly frozen, he looked into the distance. Chapter 1517 Supernova. On the crumbling streets of twilight, a grotesque nightmare creature was mauling another with its fangs, while a rain of swords and spears fell on its tough hide. Each strike caused streams of fetid blood to pour out of ghastly wounds, but the abominations paid it no attention. Ah, it hurts. Mordred, who had taken the body of the nightmare creature, was not having a great time. Not only was he being cut and mangled by the vessels of the imposter, but it was also getting hard to breathe. The air was full of smoke, and the buildings around him had caught fire, at some point. But he was so close. Finally, the abominations he had been brutalizing shuddered and died. An ethereal stream of power flowed into his soul, and he fled into the reflections, escaping the cruel blades of the hollow vessels. Appearing a few hundred meters away from the pursuing mob, he left the dying body of the battered nightmare creature and returned to his own. Before too long, a familiar pain tore apart his soul, forcing Mordred to groan. Why does it have to be so unpleasant? A new core was being born in the depths of his soul. He was becoming a monster once again. This will give me some breathing room. The human flood was already surrounding him, seemingly endless. Mordred had only a few seconds of reprieve before the puppets of Soul Stealer would assault him again. His perception spread far and wide, jumping between countless reflections to observe the world. He saw Song of the Fallen, the blind witch. He also saw a giant made of shadows wield a jade sword against a harrowing dragon. Sunless, the madman, was fighting against the Dread Lord. Nightingale was there, as well, kneeling near a puddle of water. At that moment, Mordred's eyes glistened, and a sinister thought entered his mind. Can I? He hesitated for a moment, unsure. But then, a dark smile twisted his lips. Well, even if I fail, it will at least be entertaining. Mordred moved, contemplating how much essence he had left. Reaching the distant fortress would be a challenge. But then, he was distracted from these calculations. That was because he saw something else. Turning toward the heart of the city, Mordred froze for a moment. His eyes widened slightly. Cassie leaned against a broken wall, clutching her mangled neck. Her armor was slick with blood, and she felt weak. Her beautiful face was pale and tired. Go. The echo of the slain Sibyl floated away, the hem of her red dress hovering above the cobblestones. She was going to buy her master some time to escape, and then drown in the flood of hollow-eyed warriors. Sighing, Cassie pushed herself off the wall and continued to flee. She dodged and evaded the nightmare creatures that lunged at her from the ruins, not bothering to retaliate. There was no time for it. The lives of Effie and Jet were hanging in a fragile balance. They were literally hanging from her neck, hidden in an iron locket. That locket pressed her down with the weight of a mountain. She couldn't allow herself to make mistakes. I must escape. Making another turn, she came to a halt in front of a devastated space. Behind her was the tide of pursuing warriors, all staring at her with those eerie empty eyes of theirs. In front of her were the broken gates of twilight. Beyond them, there was nothing but still water. There was nowhere else to run. Cassie let out a quiet sigh. Turning around, she lowered her blooded hand and unsheathed the quiet dancer. The slender rapier glistened in the light of dawn, pointing at the approaching puppets of Soul Stealer. She gritted her teeth. Come, then. It's time. In the heart of twilight, Nephis finally reached the Serpent King's palace. The palace was no more. It had collapsed, at some point, turning into a vast ruin. Blood flowed between the shattered stones. The Dread Lord was not here. Sunny was nowhere to be seen, either. She was late. A heavy sigh escaped from her lips. Behind Nephis, twilight was wreathed in white flames. In front of her, a dozen warriors stood motionlessly, surrounding a monstrous figure in a tattered vermilion cloak. If not for his mirror-like eyes, she would not have recognized Mordred of Valor, Soul Stealer. His original body. Nephis stared at the monster silently, an incandescent void shining through her eyes. Then, she took a step forward. Her armor had long crumbled. Her white tunic was torn and cut, revealing the soft radiance of her skin. Even her sword was covered by a net of cracks, ready to shatter into a whirlwind of sparks. She was tired. Found you. Nephis walked toward Soul Stealer, and the figures surrounding him moved to meet her. At the same time, thousands upon thousands of human vessels were pouring from the burning streets, surrounding her. There was no end to them. She had killed so many, but no matter how many she killed, the flood of bodies never ceased. It only grew. Aye. The first figure reached her, summoning a long spear. Nephis raised her sword and met its strike. The second figure was already lunging from the side, the third, the fourth. She tried to block, evade, and deflect them all. A few moments later, her sword broke. Even then, Nephis continued to move forward. Step after step, wound after wound, she slowly, tortuously made her way toward Soul Stealer. She almost made it. There were only a few meters left between her and the monstrous creature now, but those several meters were like an insurmountable abyss. Pushed down, Nephis fell to her knees. 7 spears were piercing her radiant body, nailing it to the ground. She couldn't heal these wounds until the spears were gone, but those holding them had no intention of retrieving their weapons. Impaled on them and held down, Nephis couldn't move. Sensing a movement ahead, she raised her head and looked at the approaching monster. Her radiant image was reflected in his mirror-like eyes. Soul Stealer stopped a couple steps away, looking down at her with an empty gaze. His pale lips twisted into a strange smile. Sis, Ter. His inhuman voice sounded like shards of broken glass. Nephis looked down. The radiance suffusing her skin dimmed a little. A tormented sigh escaped from her lips. Kneeling, just like she had at the end of the second nightmare, Nephis said, I came into this world as a sharp blade. She raised her head slightly and looked at the monstrous creature with a tired gaze. But with every step I took, my edge was dulled. Her face slowly became impassive, devoid of all emotion. Her voice was like a whisper. I've made compromises, learned how to act reasonably, and forced myself to move with restraint. Nephis took a deep breath and remained silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had grown steady and loud. A hint of an indescribable emotion appeared in her radiant eyes. Glaring at the monstrous creature, she said, I am tired of compromises. I am tired of being reasonable. I am tired of being restrained. Nephis looked into the eyes of Soul Stealer, furious flames igniting in the depths of her own. I am changing star of the immortal flame clan. Her gaze was suddenly full of cold contempt. Her even tone trembled with incinerating passion. Who dares to stop me? And when she spoke those words, the soft radiance suffusing her skin exploded with brilliant light. A hurricane wind rose, stirring the fire devouring the streets of twilight. The 7 spears impaling Nephis to the ground caught aflame, melting in its scorching white heat. Although it seemed impossible, the blinding light emanating from her incandescent figure grew even more intense, unbearable to look at. If Sunny was there to see Nephis, he would have witnessed her 6 radiant soul cores swelling with furious light. He would have also seen one of them becoming covered by a net of fiery cracks. Soul Stealer moved, reaching forward, but he was too late. In the next moment, all the flames burning across the ruins of twilight were suddenly absorbed by the incandescent figure kneeling in front of him. For a split second, the world was still and silent. There was a whisper. And then, everything dissolved in white radiance. Chapter 1518 Ruin. Standing on the crumbling wall of the floating fortress, Sunny saw the light grow dim above twilight. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the entire world was suddenly drowned in white radiance, blinding him. Stunned, he raised a hand to cover his eyes and saw a pristine star ignite in the heart of the distant city. It swelled, growing into a massive sphere of furious flame. Everything happened in an instant. The buildings nearest to the white star simply dissolved in its pure light, evaporating. Those further away exploded into dust and were erased from existence by an obliterating shockwave. Those behind them were flattened and melted, turning to ash from the immolating heat. A wave of incinerating fire, taller than the towering walls of the city, spread outward at lightning speed, consuming everything in its path: buildings, trees, cobblestones, even air itself, and all the tiny human figures flooding the crumbling streets. Behind it, the furious star rose and deformed, slowly turning into a mushroom cloud of incandescent white flame. The pillar of fire supporting it dwarfed everything, reaching toward the sky. What? Even driven into madness by fury, he was momentarily paralyzed by the harrowing splendor of that inconceivable sight. Twilight. Twilight was being destroyed in front of his eyes. That was when the invisible shockwave reached the fortress, shattering its walls and throwing him down. The deafening roar of the explosion came next, shaking the world. Sonny plummeted from the broken wall and hit the cold stones with a sickening sound. Bouncing off the hard surface, he rolled and then instinctively covered his head with his hands. In the next moment, a rain of stone debris fell down, pummeling him like crushing hail. Who dares? Deaf from the cataclysmic roar of the blast, he screamed furiously and tried to stand up. Something hit him on the head, but Sonny did not care. Hunched, he rose from the ground and peered into the dust that had enveloped everything around, searching for the massive figure of the dragon. So what if all of Twilight was devoured by flame? So what if it seemed like the sky had been shattered and fell down? He was still going to kill the hateful worm. Why is it so dark? The colossal pillar of flame had reached the heavens and collapsed on itself, torn apart by the wind. The furious light of the pure white star had dimmed and disappeared, plunging the world into darkness. A vast cloud of ash rose into the air and obscured the seven suns, turning the twilight of dawn into a lightless gloom of dark devastation. Far away, in the scorched desert that had been twilight, ash fell from the sky like snow. In the heart of the ruined city, nothing but darkness remained. Even the air itself had been burned away by the inconceivable heat of the obliterating explosion, and so there were no flames burning on the blackened stones. The only source of illumination in that dark abyss was a radiant figure that stood amidst the destruction, surrounded by ash and ruins. It was slowly coalescing back into the shape of a beautiful young woman from pure light. Her brilliant skin did not have a single blemish on it, and her shining hair flowed like incandescent silver, emanating a blinding white radiance. Her pristine light reflected in the boiling water, creating a small island of light in the sea of searing darkness. Twilight was still and silent, with nothing but water moving on its vast, smoldering expanse. The numerous human bodies of Soul Stealer were all gone, devoured by the merciless flames and turned to ash. The nightmare creatures who had battled against them were gone, too. Only Nephis remained, illuminating the darkness with her light. And because she was the only one left, the indestructible reflection of the sinister mirror fiend had nowhere to go but into the depths of her radiant, harrowing eyes. Nephis was standing on the surface of a calm ocean. The world around her was suffused with sunlight, and the perfectly still water below her bare feet glowed beautifully, reflecting the brilliance of heaven. It was as if she was standing on a sea of golden clouds, awash in breathtaking light. 7 suns shone brightly above her head. She looked at them impassively. She had felt the terrible agony of one of her soul cores, the Terror Core, destroying itself before. But so many defiled abominations had been consumed by the unleashed flames of her soul that it was reformed anew. With it, the 7th core was born. The last core. The pain of its creation had already passed, and Nephis was a titan now. She looked away from the 7 suns and gazed silently at the only spot of dirt and darkness in her perfectly radiant world. Out there, some distance away, a repulsive creature stood, staring at her with mirror-like eyes. It did not look like a human, nor did it look like a nightmare creature. Instead, it was like a revolting amalgamation of countless people, countless abominations, all joined together into a monstrous patchwork being that shifted and changed form with every move, every breath, every moment that passes. The shifting monster towered above her, staining the pure waters of her soul with darkness and corruption. Soul Stealer grinned, reaching forward with countless hands. He called her name with countless voices. His countless eyes festered with hatred and greed, but also fear. Nephis looked at him with contempt. Her even voice echoed across the radiant expanse, uttering a single word. Burn. And then, the beautiful landscape of her soul changed. The water Soul Stealer stood upon was no water at all. Instead, it was liquid flame, as if he was standing on the surface of a furious white star. The golden clouds floating above him were not vapor, but incandescent gas, as if he was drowning in burning stardust. Most harrowing of all, though, was the light of the 7 suns. Because here in the sea of changing stars' soul, there was no escape from their incinerating rays. The radiance of the 7 suns swelled, turning the calm ocean into an incandescent white void. And, trapped in that merciless void, Soul Stealer burned. Chapter 1519 Reverse Scale. The floor of the floating fortress was tilted, and Sunny could hear the sound of water rushing into the breaches. His sight was obstructed by the cloud of dust, so he closed his eyes and sensed a massive figure stirring in the darkness. He grinned, forgetting about how torn and battered his body was. Looking up, Sunny saw 2 cold silver stars burning in the darkness high above him, the eyes of the murderous dragon, gazing down upon him. The dragon moved, and at the same time, the shadows moved, as well. The drowning fortress shuddered. Slumped near a puddle of water, Kai gasped for air. He was suffering from terrible pain and struggling to breathe. That blow Sunny had delivered him before was not a light one. He suspected that several of his ribs had been cracked or broken. His muscles were torn, as well, so drawing the bow was a torment. This, really is a nightmare. More than anything, Kai felt lost and confused. The battle the government forces were supposed to observe had already been a disaster. The terrible journey through the merciless white desert was like a feverish dream. Before he knew it, they were standing in front of a towering block of black stone, preparing to enter a seed of nightmare. Kai had thought that he had prepared himself mentally for the dreadful trial of the spell, but he had been wrong. Coming to his senses in the dim throne room of a mysterious palace was unlike anything he had ever expected, and much more terrible. Sunny was there, pulling him away from the falling debris. He heard some outlandish things about an evil dragon, who was also his twin, and an army of alien warriors that were supposed to help the cohort. A few moments later, the dark dragon was in front of them, commanding them to kneel. Kai knew that Sunny never lied, of course. But hearing that voice and feeling the irresistible authority contained within it, he fully realized that it was all true. The abominable dragon was, indeed, a copy of him. A much more powerful, vile, and corrupted version of Kai, who had betrayed his friends and was now trying to kill them. How could he turn on Sunny, Effie, Cassie, Nephis, and Colonel Jet? Kai did not know, but the truth was undeniable. Learning that truth hurt much more than having his ribs broken. Things had moved very fast from that point, not giving him an opportunity to process the bitter revelations and make sense of what was happening. Sunny warned him to stay away and suddenly turned into a giant serpent, attacking the dragon furiously. Had his friend somehow become a saint, already? Kai did not know. Why did he have to stay away? He did not know that, either. There were many things Kai did not understand, but then, there was no real need to. At the core of it, the situation was clear. The cohort was up against a dreadful foe, and the lives of his friends were hanging in balance. That was why Kai tried to help Sunny fight the dragon, as best he could. The 3 of them rose into the sky, and he saw a strange city built on a vast island, illuminated by the light of 7 rising suns. The streets of the city were flooded with people. Those people were fighting against a legion of nightmare creatures, but somehow seemed more sinister than the abominations they fought. Kai only caught a glimpse of them, though, engrossed by the battle against the vile dragon, against himself. Sunny seemed to have lost his mind, for some reason, shifting between the forms of various harrowing creatures. Consumed by fury, he wasn't able to differentiate between friend and foe. That was how Kai ended up being battered and suffering grievous wounds from his own friend. He should have listened to Sunny's warning better. But even if he had, he wouldn't have left Sunny to fight against the abominable dragon alone. Eventually, the 3 of them ended up away from the city, across the vast expanse of water littered with dreadful corpses, in the ruins of a fallen fortress. There was a bright flash, and the deafening roar of a distant explosion. And now, Kai was surrounded by darkness. Cold water was licking his skin. Using his awakened ability, Kai could see through the darkness. He could also see through the billowing dust, and even through the stone debris. All around him, the world had gone mad. The shadows were surging, turning into numerous dark hands. Those hands, each possessing 7 fingers, tore at the dreadful dragon with sharp claws. At the same time, Sunny was trying to build another giant around himself, his attempts failing time after time. The dragon seemed wary of the enormous white sword that lay on the cold stones, partially buried in rubble, and so destroyed the giant ruthlessly, each time, before it could take shape. Slowly but surely, Sunnis' body became tattered and broken. Even though he did not bleed, Kai could see that his condition was deteriorating swiftly. Sunny did not seem to care, consumed by the strange derangement, but Kai did. I have to do something. Even though Kai was not as powerful as his friends, he was not at all weak. He was an ascended, too. He had led soldiers into battle and killed dreadful nightmare creatures, survived impossible odds, and triumphed where most other people would have perished. He had burned alive in the dragon's flame, and lived to slay the dragon. The problem was that Kai could not really move. His head was full of dreadful whispers, and the remnant will of the abominable dragon was forcing him to do things he never wanted to do. Simply resisting that call was taking all of his strength, and that was with the dragon not paying him any attention, as well. His thoughts were not his own. Betrayed you, poisoned you, made you into an abomination, lured you, abandoned you, traitor, traitor, traitor. Kai groaned and grabbed his head, but the whispers only grew louder. The worst part about them was that, because of his flaw, Kai knew that it was all true. He, the other he, had indeed been betrayed, corrupted, used, and abandoned. By none other than Sunny, the person he trusted the most. The other Sunny, perhaps. At least that was what the dragon believed. Hurt him, kill him, punish him, take his hope away, take his will away, take his crown away. Kai gritted his teeth, refusing to listen. He knew himself very well. That wasn't him. That wasn't them. Luckily, Sunny was attacking the dragon so fiercely that it had no time to turn its gaze at Kai. And so, the insurmountable authority of its command was slowly growing weaker. Groaning, Kai turned to the puddle of water and looked at the one who was hiding in the reflections. His lips moved. Be ready. With that, he slowly picked up his bow and raised it with trembling hands. His bow was a transcendent memory of the 5th tier, and there were plenty of enchanted arrows in his soul arsenal. The problem was that, despite that, Kai had failed to deal substantial damage to the abominable dragon. Ironically, the most damage he had dealt was to the shadow giant Sunny created, just before the explosion. However, with his supernatural sight, Kai had long noticed a special scale hidden on the dragon's chest. It was of a different color than all others, as if forged from iron, and had a peculiar shape. Looking down, he looked at the iron amulet in the shape of an anvil hanging from a string on his neck. That amulet had been with him since the second nightmare, given to him by Sunny. And so, his evil copy must have possessed it, as well. Ignoring the pain, Kai gritted his teeth and rose, then strained his muscles, and drew his bow. The string was heavy. One shot. Sunny seemed to be moments away from death, so there would be no time for another. He couldn't miss. He wouldn't miss. Silencing the deafening whispers that drowned his mind, Kai did what he was best at, aimed his bow, held his breath, and allowed his fingers to slip from the string. A sinister red arrow flashed through the darkness, and hit the small iron scale hidden among countless others on the chest of the lunging dragon. The dragon's claws tore through the forming shadow giant and struck Sunny, pressing him into the ground. The arrow failed to pierce the creature's tough hide, and so Kai swayed, suddenly weak from blood loss. But it did break that single scale, cracking it in two. In the next moment, the man hiding in the reflection was suddenly gone, and the dragon froze in place. Something sinister reflected in the depths of his silver eyes. Chapter 1520 Dreadful Soul. Audiobook by the Nut Lord. All text belongs to the original author. Please support them online. This fan project is non-profit. Join the Discord for more audiobooks, and comment any mispronunciations so I can fix them. What a sight. Mordred watched as Nightingale, picturesque despite being blooded and covered in dust, drew his bow and let an arrow loose. He had fled to the floating fortress after noticing the denial amulet fused into the Dread Lord's scales, and just in time. Something truly curious had happened in twilight, destroying all the reflections he could have used to take a look. It was probably Changing Star's fault, or Soul Stealer's fault. In any case, Mordred would have been burned to a crisp if he had not left the city. After traversing the still water and reaching the fortress, he hid in the reflections and observed what was happening inside. Sunless was fighting like a madman, more of a madman than he usually was, while the Dread Lord viciously mauled and battered him. Truly, it was a miracle that Sunless had been able to battle the tyrant of Verge for so long, and even deliver countless wounds to the mighty dragon. What other master could have done the same? That guy really boggled the mind. Nevertheless, there was something strange about their fight. The defiled saint could have gone for the kill a long time ago, but he was restraining himself. Probably because he wanted to capture Sunless alive and make him a slave again. That made sense. Although Mordred mostly knew about the 6 plagues from the records he had spied in the frozen reflection of twilight, the Mad Prince seemed to have been the deterrent the Tyrant of Verge used to keep the other 5 defiled champions in check, especially Soul Stealer. Now that Soul Stealer had finally turned on him, Sunless and his sinister soul were the best weapon the Dread Lord could use against the rebellious fiend. Mordred studied Nightingale for a while, amused. Have I really submitted to that naive fool? Well, he must not have remained naive for long after becoming defiled. Still, how had Soul Stealer missed the chance to become the master of the Mad Prince himself, after Changing Star was gone? The imposter was really a disappointment. Regardless, Mordred had spoken to the Nightingale, the original carrier of the Denial Amulet, just before Twilight went up in flames. The charming archer had a part to play. And now, it seemed that he had played it brilliantly. A red arrow whistled through the air and struck the small scale on the chest of the giant dragon, cracking it. What a shot! How hard would it be to hit a target so small, and a moving one at that? Mordred allowed himself to admire the precision of the ascended archer for a split second, and then dove into the Dread Lord's corrupted soul. Here we go. Smiling, Mordred found himself surrounded by darkness. The darkness extended its revolting tendrils, trying to catch him. A forest of them rose from all sides, slithering like snakes. Trembling slightly, he evaded the grasp of corruption and dashed forward. That's why I hate invading the souls of nightmare creatures. At least he possessed both of his hands here. Sadly, Mordred could only reflect the powers and weapons of the master of the invaded soul, not use his own. And since the Dread Lord had surrendered to defilement and was thus banished from the nightmare spell, there were no memories here for Mordred to summon. The memories were given by the spell, and taken away by the spell. There were other things he could steal, though. Almost caught by the harrowing tendrils, he jumped and soared into the air. Flying was not something Mordred did often, but he had experienced it before, so, learning how to use this particular ability only took him a moment. His body rippled and swelled, becoming covered by impregnable scales. 2 mighty wings sprouted from his back, and his teeth turned into sharp porcelain fangs. He became a dragon. Mordred had not been a dragon before, but he had stolen bodies of nightmare creatures of a similar kind. So, he grew accustomed to this new shape quickly. Finally, his eerie gaze pierced the vile darkness and found a figure standing in the heart of it, lonesome and lost. The soul of the Dread Lord still maintained its human appearance. He must not have surrendered to corruption entirely, yet. A vicious smile twisted Mordred's reptilian lips. Time to die. He wasn't sure which one of them was going to die, but was eager to find out. Mordred was merely an ascended monster right now, while the Dread Lord, there were 5 repugnant masses of corruption hidden in the boundless darkness of his defiled soul, so he had to be a corrupted tyrant. The chances of victory were slim. But then again, Mordred had killed numerous foes who were more powerful than him, more experienced than him, more knowledgeable about the nuances of their aspects than him, more proficient in using their memories than him. However, none of them had been as resourceful as him, as resolute as him, or as ruthless as him. Nightingale was a brave, but naive fool, so how much better could his corrupted version be? If there was one thing Mordred was afraid of, though, it was the knowledge of the defilement the Dread Lord wielded. That was why this battle was a gamble, even more so than every other soul battle Mordred had fought in the past. I'll just have to kill him before he has time to say anything, then. In the distance, the lonesome figure moved, finally noticing the invader. A mad light ignited in the Dread Lord's eyes. Far away, among the scorched ruins of Twilight, nothing living moved. The buildings, those that were far enough from the epicenter of the blast to not be reduced to dust, had either collapsed or stood blackened and deformed. Ash fell from the dark sky like snow, covering the desolate landscape. Most of the living beings that had witnessed the birth of the radiant star had been turned to ash, but piles of smoldering corpses still remained at the edges of the city. The walls surrounding Twilight had collapsed, and the giant carcasses beyond them were scorched. A pale hand rose from the water among those carcasses. Surfacing, Cassie climbed onto the carapace of a dead abomination and gulped for air. Then, she collapsed and lay motionlessly, ash falling on her face from the dark sky. The iron locket was still with her, safe and sound. A slender rapier hovered in the air above the blind girl, seemingly concerned. Cassie concentrated on it, feeling her consciousness begin to slip. Go. The quiet dancer hesitated for a few moments, then disappeared into the darkness. Cassie sighed and allowed her battered body to relax. Laying on the blackened carapace of a dead abomination, she turned her head to face the ruins of Twilight. A cold, pale smile appeared on her lips. In the heart of the destroyed city, Nephis slowly opened her eyes. Soul Stealer was no more. The bright radiance suffusing her skin slowly grew dim and disappeared. The white flames dancing in her eyes were extinguished. Her silver hair, which had been flowing in an ethereal wind, fell down. Standing naked amidst the scene of utter devastation, she shivered and looked around. Her mind was empty. After a while, Nephis realized that her tunic had been destroyed, and summoned another memory. The familiar weight of the Starlight Legion armor, the only one she had left, settled on her shoulders, making her feel comforted. That armor. It felt as if she was forgetting something. Twilight. Soul Stealer, the Dread Lord. As she remained motionless, considering her thoughts, a slender rapier fell from the dark sky and hovered in front of her, trembling slightly. Nephis looked at it impassively. The rapier turned, its tip pointing into the darkness. You want to lead me somewhere. Quiet dancer, that was Cassie's echo. The rapier trembled again, and then flew forward. Frowning slightly, Nephis followed. Chapter 1521 Sharpest Arrow. In the courtyard of the drowning fortress, a harrowing dragon growled and took a step back, its massive body shuddering. His silver eyes had lost their sinister light, turning glossy and unfocused. A vicious battle must have been taking place in the dragon's corrupted soul. The maddening whispers thundering in Kai's head finally grew silent. He swayed, then took a labored breath and limped towards Sunny. His friend was laying on the cold stones, barely alive. His body was a terrible painting of torn flesh, white bones visible through its mangled mess. Eerily, he was still not bleeding at all. Usually, Kai would have been reassured by that fact, but right now, it looked like Sunny was already a cold corpse. But he wasn't a corpse. Sunny was still moving, struggling to stand up. Even after battling a defiled saint tooth and nail, he was still unbroken, trying to continue to fight. As Kai approached, he heard his furious whispers. "Kill you. I'll kill you. Shut up. I'll tear you apart." Strangely enough, his hateful gaze was not directed at the archer. Instead, Sunny was glaring past him, seemingly at an empty spot. Kai felt his heart tighten. What is happening to him? Sunny had always had a wild personality, and there was that time he had turned a little feral in the Dark City, but he was never truly mad. Now, however, it seemed as though his friend had entirely lost his mind. There must be a reason. He had warned Kai to stay away before, had he not? That meant that this strange condition Sunny was in had a purpose. To resist the authority of the Dread Lord, most likely, somehow. It had to be a part of some cunning scheme. He would deal with it later. For now, Kai had a more serious problem to solve. The abominable dragon was still alive. And while that man, Mordred, seemed confident in himself, there was no telling who would prevail in their dire fight. The result would be clear in seconds. But Kai looked at the dragon with a lost expression. The Dread Lord, Mordred, both of them were monsters. He still remembered what the scion of the great clan Vaylor had done in the second nightmare. The harrowing massacre he had perpetrated in the Kingdom of Hope was not something a sane person would ever commit. Even if he did win, was it really fine to let the dreadful authority of Kai's voice fall into the hands of someone so depraved? Wait a little more, Sunny. I'll come back for you, soon. Turning away from his friend, Kai gritted his teeth and pushed himself off the ground. Soaring into the air, he strained his core muscles to draw the string of his bow, and at the same time, summoned the sharpest arrow he had in store. That one was not capable of producing devastating blasts, or robbing nightmare creatures of their strength. Its enchantment was rather simple, it burrowed much deeper than other arrows would, piercing flesh and bone like butter. The drawback was that the arrow was flimsy and fragile. It was disobedient and slow, too, so hitting anything with it was a tough task. More than that, its tip would shatter against any kind of armor, therefore, it wasn't easy to make use of the insidious enchantment. But now that the abominable dragon was nearly paralyzed by the battle happening within its soul, Kai had a chance. Of course, the battle could end at any moment. It could even end right now, leaving him defenseless in front of the terrifying dragon. Nevertheless, he brought himself right to the dragon's maw, and looked into the dragon's silver eyes. Then, Kai activated his ascended ability and uttered a command. He wasn't addressing the Dread Lord, however. He was addressing himself. Kill him. Suddenly, a fierce strength filled his broken body, and a cold, frightening will flooded his mind. Raising his bow, Kai aimed carefully, and sent an arrow flying straight through the Dread Lord's radiant eye. The distance was too short for it to stray off course, and there was no armor in the way to make the tip break. The insidious arrow slid into the dragon's eye, pierced through it, and burrowed deep into the creature's brain. It had been shot from a transcendent bow of the 5th tier by the hand of a master, and so the havoc it wreaked inside the Dread Lord's head was truly gruesome. His body had been battered in the battle against Sunny, and his soul had been weakened by the battle against Mordred of Valor. The dragon shuddered and let out a terrible groan. Blasted by that groan, Kai was thrown back and crashed into the pile of stone rubble far below. Above him, the Dread Lord convulsed, a fountain of silver blood shooting from his open maw. His head drew an arc in the air. And then, the mighty dragon toppled and fell heavily to the ground, his silver eyes growing dim. This time, forever. Barely conscious, Kai heard the spell whisper into his ear. You have slain a corrupted tyrant, hideous ruler of the empty sky. You have? Consumed by pain, he didn't hear the rest. He did, however, hear a terrible scream. Turning his head, Kai saw a human figure rolling on the ground in agony. It was Mordred, the scion of Valor, missing a hand and covered in blood. There was something terribly wrong with that lunatic, though. His face, which had seemed to be incapable of showing earnest emotions, was now twisted by a terrible grimace, an eerie darkness devouring his eyes. Letting out a stifled groan, Mordred clutched at the stones and crawled to the nearby puddle. Reaching it, he thrust his hand into the water, no, into his own reflection, and tore something from within his chest, then threw it away. The thing looked like a soul shard, no, a piece of a mirror. Hitting the ground, the mirror shard suddenly rippled and turned into a vague figure. That figure then turned into a perfect copy of Mordred. A reflection, created by ripping one of his cores out of his soul. There was something terribly wrong with that reflection, though. As Kai watched, stunned, the visage of Mordred was twisted and deformed, tendrils of vile darkness sprouting from within it. The ghastly creature suddenly looked incredibly threatening and sinister, a frenzied smile blooming on its blooded lips. It was as though he was watching a seed of corruption bloom, turning the human into a nightmare creature right in front of his eyes. Still on the ground, Mordred whispered a quiet curse. Ah, that was truly unpleasant. He did not look capable of fighting the defiled reflection, though, in that wretched state. Kai was laying in the rubble, his body broken and mangled, so he was not much better. Sunny was still writhing on the ground, trying to stand up, but he was the most corpse-like of them three. I must protect him. Kai tried to move, but a surge of pain sent him crushing back down on the sharp stones. A short yelp escaped from his lips. With unwanted tears in his eyes, he looked up and saw the vile reflection walking toward his friend. Its missing hand had sprouted terrible glass claws, and its jaw was unhinged, twisted fangs growing through the mangled flesh. No. Before the creature could reach Sunny, though, a slender rapier pierced its chest, and a radiant hand grasped its head. In the next moment, the reflection was illuminated from inside by a pure white light. Smoke rose from its open mouth and charred holes where its eyes had been just a moment ago, filling the air with the revolting stench of burned flesh. Then, a net of cracks covered the creature's body, and it shattered like a glass sculpture. Behind it, the figure of Changing Star was revealed, looking down with an emotionless expression. Sparks of pure white flame danced in her cold grey eyes, and she somehow seemed both the same and different from the last time Kai had seen her, back in the Nightmare Desert. Turning her head slightly, Nephis looked at the corpse of the harrowing dragon and remained motionless for a few moments. Then, she said, her voice strangely devoid of feeling. We won. Chapter 1522 Break of Dawn. Driven to madness by wrath, Sunny was forcing his mangled body to move. His mind was muddled by fury and pain, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stand up, for some reason. An inferno of dark, malignant rage was consuming his aching heart. No, no, no. The dragon, the hateful worm, was laying dead on the wet stones, stolen from him. Silver blood was pouring from his opened maw and obliterated eye, slowly spreading across the ruined courtyard. If only there had been more time, if only no one had interfered in their fight. Sunny would have been able to slay the Dread Lord himself. He knew he would. But the dragon was gone. And now that he was gone, Sunny's suffocating fury needed a new target. Kill them all, I'll kill them. He could sense several shapes through the shadows. the loathsome fly that had stolen his prey, the crippled fiend who had come from the water, and a macabre abomination that had been spawned by a tainted shard of the fiend's soul. And the most odious of them all, a pale young man wearing a nebulous black mantle, who was looking at him mockingly with a derisive smile. "Look at you, fool! Mad as a hatter! How pathetic, how familiar, how distasteful!" Sonny growled. The abomination was staggering toward him, piercing him with the demented gaze of its rotten eyes. Glass claws were growing from its stump, and twisted fangs were growing from its blooded maw. He grinned. Good, good. He couldn't stand up, for the moment, so the creature was graciously delivering itself to him. Sonny was going to enjoy tearing it apart. But before he could, a slender rapier pierced the abomination's chest, and a radiant hand grasped its head. The creature glowed with incandescent light, being incinerated from within, and then shattered like a broken mirror. He howled, his hoarse voice full of indescribable rage. No, no. Another, they stole another from him. Thieves, traitors. He had to kill them, rip them, savage them, break them. As Sonny growled and tried to push his mangled body up, someone approached and halted a mere step away. He looked up and saw a breathtaking young woman looking at him silently from above, her beautiful face devoid of emotion. Her silver hair was moving slightly in the wind, and radiant sparks were dancing in her cold gray eyes. "I'll destroy you." Sonny tried to summon the shadows to rip the young woman's body apart, but his muddled mind failed to contain the intricate patterns of the manifested forms. The vicious shadow hands crumbled and dissolved before taking shape. The young woman studied him for a few moments, then kneeled and put a hand on his head, caressing his hair. Her touch made Sonny shudder. "I have to kill her." The visage of the smoke streaming from the abomination's burned eyes flashed in his mind and disappeared, drowning in the sea of madness. But, somehow, even though Sonny wanted nothing more than to see the young woman die, he hesitated for a moment. It was then that she spoke, her voice sounding both strange and familiar. "Sonny." He gathered his strength, preparing to lunge at her. "Dismiss your crown." He had not thought that a more profound rage existed, but when he heard those words, his entire being ignited with a harrowing fury. The thought of surrendering his crown filled Sonny with a boundless ocean of frenzied wrath, deep and dark enough to be unfathomable. That wrath was far more scorching than the rage he had felt toward the odious dragon, and vaster than even the hatred he felt toward the thieves who had stolen his prey. However, the authority contained in the voice of the young woman was absolute. It was nothing like the cold commands of the dragon, which had been oppressive and domineering to the point of being irresistible, but only nearly so. There was a boundless abyss between nearly and absolutely. Drowning in fury and at the same time filled with horror, Sonny felt his very soul respond to the young woman's order, following it obediently, as if he had no will of his own. He felt broken and violated, which only made his bloodlust and desire to kill explode more. Despite that, though, he still could not even attempt to disobey. She ordered me. The crown of twilight dissolved into a whirlwind of sparks. And with it, Sonny's frenzied wrath disappeared as well, leaving behind only horror, confusion, too, and pain. Finally, the pain he had been ignoring caught up with Sonny, making him shudder and let out a tormented groan. He was consumed by agony. But then, the hand resting on his head ignited with a soft glow, and its comforting warmth chased the pain away. A wave of cleansing white flame spread through his body, mending his broken flesh and healing his harrowing wounds. The sense of relief it brought was overwhelming, which only added to Sonny's confusion. Soon, he was left laying on the ground, disoriented and feeling lost. Everything that had happened since he activated the King's Resentment enchantment of the Crown of Twilight was like a blur, but the memory of it remained, etched into his mind. What happened? Sonny felt incredibly tired, but he forced himself to raise his head. Nephis was kneeling in front of him, wearing the Starlight Legion armor, for some reason. Her striking grey eyes were calm and cold. Behind her, the corpse of the Dread Lord towered above the ruined courtyard of the floating fortress. Kai was laying on a pile of rubble, heavily wounded. Mordred was there, as well, staring at the dead dragon with a grim expression. The world was dark, with only a few rays of pale sunshine pouring through the veil of ashen clouds. There was something else, as well. A black crow was perched on the remnants of the broken wall, staring down at them. Sonny looked at Nephis, a storm of emotions raging in his heart. Noticing that he had regained his senses, she nodded simply and rose. Turning away, she walked toward where Kai was laying, his ivory armor painted by blood. Soon, soft radiance flowed from her hands, healing the archer. At the same time, Mordred sighed deeply and looked at Kai with a hint of resentment. Why did you do it? I almost had him. Kai met his gaze sommely, and then said in a hoarse voice, that was why I did it. The Prince of Nothing remained silent for a moment, then grinned with dark amusement and turned to Nephis. Waving his bloody stump in the air, he asked blithely, don't I get healed? Her answer was cold and even. Wait for your turn. Sunny observed it all, too tired to move, and too numb to think. Soon, two figures climbed over the pile of rubble that the wall of the fortress had turned to. They were Effie and Jet. Effie was walking while supporting her weight with a spear, while Jet was carrying unconscious Cassie. When she appeared, both Crow and the quiet dancer rushed to her side. The wind tore apart the veil of clouds, and finally, the light of dawn illuminated the drowning fortress once again. Sunny looked at the sky pensively. A strange thought surfaced in his mind. We won. Chapter 1523 Endlessly Flowing. Soon enough, the wind carried the clouds of ash away. Twilight was once again illuminated by the beautiful light of dawn, what was left of twilight, at least. The floating fortress where the dread lord had died broke apart and drowned in the still water. The water itself was starting to move, sparkling in the sunlight. Now that the Serpent King's city and whatever enchantments had held it in place were destroyed, the current was slowly returning. Soon enough, the current would carry it all, the blackened ruins of Twilight, the corpses of the defiled that had stormed it, and the broken ships of its fallen defenders, to the edge, then throw them into the lightless abyss that lay beyond it, where they would never be found or seen again, unless someone braved the void and reached the very bottom of Ariel's dreadful world, erasing all signs that Twilight had ever existed from the endlessly flowing surface of the great river. Until the next cycle came. Hopefully, Sunny would not be there to witness it. The cohort had returned aboard the chain breaker before the fortress drowned. Now, they were observing the charred carcass of the inconceivable abomination that had served as the foundation of Twilight slowly crumbling and submerging underwater. The brilliant explosion had put a net of cracks into it, and now, the weight of the immense carapace and the water pressure were slowly pulling it apart. Well, some of them were observing. Some were in no condition to pay it much attention, if any at all. Cassie was still unconscious. Her wounds, including the deep gash on her neck, had been healed by Nephis, but the blind girl was showing no signs of waking up, yet. Surviving the mayhem and the obliterating blast must have taken a toll on her. Nephis herself was sitting at the stern of the flying vessel, staring into the distance with a detached look on her face. She was utterly exhausted, but also, this was her usual state after overusing her aspect. It was as if her humanity had been burned away, and needed time to restore itself. Somehow, Sunny felt that this time, that process would take longer than it had in the past. Which was understandable. He already realized that the devastating explosion that destroyed the city, and turned every living being on its streets to ash, had been somehow caused by Nephis. Sunny did not know the details, but could see that she was a titan now. That had to be the result of her fires consuming all the nightmare creatures that had been fighting against Soul Stealer, and then killing the Mirror Fiend himself. Nephis, half-breed, innate ability granted her a portion of the soul fragments of all beings killed by her flames, after all. He himself was in no mood to observe the collapse of Twilight, either. Slumped against the trunk of the sacred tree, Sunny was not much different from Nephis. Using the king's resentment had taken a toll on him, making him feel utterly drained and exhausted. His gaze was distant, and his face was pale from fatigue. There was also a confusing storm of emotions raging in his heart, but at the same time, he was too numb to deal with that mess. For now, he was simply happy to be alive, happy that all of them were alive. While their enemies, against all odds, were dead. Saint, Fiend, and Nightmare were guarding the ship, and keeping an eye on Mordred, in case the bastard decided to do something malicious. However, the Prince of Nothing did not seem inclined to turn on his allies, at least not just yet. He walked around the chain breaker, looking curiously at this and that. That would have infuriated Sunny if he wasn't feeling so drained. What was that guy so curious about? He had already seen everything there was to see here, hiding in their eyes on the way to the second nightmare. Perhaps looking at things through someone else's eyes and doing it yourself was not quite the same. Right, perhaps this chain breaker was not the same as the real chain breaker they had left in the real world, either. In any case, Mordred was not a problem, for now. Which left only Effie, Jet, and Kai. The first two had been spared from participating in the battle for Twilight. Cassie had apparently saved them from being taken by Soul Stealer with the help of the Black Beast locket, and then carried the locket out of the city before the obliterating blast. Kai, meanwhile, was full of questions, but too polite to ask them all at once. The poor guy must have been utterly confused. Out of all of them, the start of his nightmare was perhaps the most dreadful. As a result, the three were standing at the railings, looking at the blackened corpse of Twilight and talking quietly between themselves. Kai's expression constantly changed between stunned, expressionless, and mortified. Look at him, emoting so much. Wait. He was the one who killed the Dread Lord, wasn't he? Damn. If I had a credit for every time Kai killed a dragon, I would have 2 credits now. Strange. Sunny studied the face of his friend for a few minutes, considering if he had to apologize for trying to kill him. Kai had blown up his shadow shell, too, so they were probably even. In any case, this dilemma seemed too tiring and complicated to consider right now. Looking away, Sunny turned his full attention to the wood grain of the chain breaker's deck. Everything had gone wrong in Twilight. He had failed, but also prevailed, in a sense. Soul Stealer was dead. The Dread Lord was dead, too. The army they had hoped to recruit was dead as well. And Nephis had used the Shadow Bond to cure Sunny from madness, but still. She had broken her promise. Again. And saved him, again. What a mess. Tired and confused, he closed his eyes and lowered his head to the root of the sacred tree. He just wanted to sleep. The problems, messy as they were, could wait until tomorrow. Chapter 1524 Bitter, Sweet. By the time Sunny woke up, it was night. Even this place of endless dawn had a night, just like the crimson expanse of eternal dusk had one. However, nights were short and fleeting at the edges of the great river. Before he knew it, the 7 suns were already rising again. The world became painted by the soft colors of the breaking dawn. With a sigh, Sunny rubbed his eyes and sat up. He felt strangely great. His body was in perfect shape because of Neph's healing flames, and his mental energy had been restored with the help of the Shroud of Dusk after having a good sleep. Nightmare had also guarded his dreams, as well as the dreams of everyone else aboard the chain breaker. Here in the pyramid built by the Demon of Dread, that alone was more important than one would think. Great! Nevertheless, his good mood was diminished when he remembered what had transpired in Twilight. I should probably be happy, right? Beyond himself, even. And he was, to an extent. 2 of the most dangerous enemies there were in the tomb of Ariel had been slain, so why wouldn't he? Finally, the end of this nightmare did not seem so distant as to be impossible anymore. Salvation was within reach, already visible far in the distance, just like the first rays of the rising suns were shining from beyond the horizon to break the reign of night. But Sunny couldn't feel completely happy. That victory of theirs had been too perilous, almost turning into defeat. In fact, it should have been a defeat, if not for a couple miracles. Other than that, he was not happy with himself, personally. Sunny had accomplished a few astonishing feats during the battle for Twilight, true, reaching the throne room of the Serpent King's palace, lifting the curse of frozen time, resisting the authority of the Dread Lord, fighting the defiled saint almost to a standstill while being inhabited by madness, and even realizing the full potential of his current level of mastery over Shadow Dance. What other master could boast that they were not only capable of transforming themselves akin to a saint, but were also not limited to a single static form? Turning into monstrous serpents, winged horrors, and dreadful beasts, truly, the depth of his divine aspect was slowly starting to put the entire hierarchy of Awakened under question. Most of the things Sunny had done yesterday, nobody else could have accomplished. And without him there, the cohort would have undoubtedly perished. And yet, in the end, he had been defeated. He had been defeated by the Dread Lord, and he had been defeated by the King's resentment, enchantment of the Crown of Twilight. Most of all, he had been defeated by his own lack of foresight and knowledge. He was only alive by chance. Knowing that did not feel great at all. Sunny sighed. Well, one can't win every time. He knew that such thoughts were immature and childish. He had long realized, after all, that his allies were a part of his power. So, their triumph was his triumph, just like his triumph would be theirs in turn. Still, Sunny couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed in himself. He had done remarkably well in this nightmare up until yesterday. Experiencing a serious setback was a change of pace. And then there was the fact that Nephis had to resort to using Shadow Bond in order to make him come back to his senses. He did not know how to feel about it. Logically, There was no reason to be hurt or angry. It had been done for his own good, after all, and brought him no harm. It might very well have saved the lives of his friends, too. In fact, if Sunny had been able to think at that moment, he would have asked Nephis to use her power over him to help him escape from the insidious effect of the king's resentment himself. That would have been a cunning way to cheat the system. But humans were not logical creatures. All Sunny knew was that he could not forget that moment. The horror of having his will violated in such a tyrannical fashion. The hopelessness he felt when his body and soul moved despite his wishes, refusing to obey him. Obeying someone else instead. The demented fury he had felt at that time only made the experience so much more disturbing and vivid. That memory was like a shadow that hung over his head. Grimacing, Sunny shook his head and looked around. A moment later, his expression soured. He noticed a pair of hateful eyes glaring at him from a few meters away. The Sin of Solace was back, looking at him mockingly. Finally awake, are you? So, how does it feel to be? Shut up. Sunny did not let the sword wraith finish and stood up, deciding to go find the other members of the cohort. Nephis was still in the strange state of having had her reserve of humanity burned away by the terrible torment of her flaw. Usually, she would have already been up and about, preparing breakfast for the cohort, but today, that did not happen. Instead, Nephis was simply meditating at the stern of the chain breaker, unmoved and unbothered by anything. The other members of the cohort had chosen not to disturb her. There was a tantalizing smell spreading through the air. Effie had taken it upon herself to cook up a feast, using the supplies stored in the cargo hold of the flying ship without sparing any of the ingredients. Sunny heard his stomach growl, and realized how hungry he was. Soon, all of them, even Nephis, had gathered on the mess deck, sitting around a table. Cassie had regained consciousness, but was still pale. Kai seemed to be a bit out of it, undoubtedly digesting the many incredible twists and turns of this bizarre nightmare. Effie and Jet were, more or less, their usual selves. It almost looked like the good old days when the cohort shared meals together, with the added bonus of having Jet keep them company. There was only one thing spoiling the atmosphere. Mordred was also there, sitting near Sunny and looking at them with a curious expression. The Prince of Nothing picked up a pair of chopsticks and smiled pleasantly. What's for breakfast? Chapter 1525 Memory of Light. Audiobook by the Nut Lord. All text belongs to the original author. Please support them online. This fan project is non-profit. Join the Discord for more audiobooks, and comment any mispronunciations so I can fix them. The breakfast ended up passing in a strange atmosphere. Which was understandable, considering that they were sharing the table with a homicidal maniac. Mordred was nothing but amiable and pleasant, but it was exactly his disarming charm that made everyone feel disturbed and uncomfortable. After all, they all knew what the Prince of Nothing was capable of, some better than others. Mordred was not the only one who made the conversation feel stifled, though. Nephis was still detached and impassive. Cassie was keeping quiet, as if she had forgotten how to speak. Sunny was not in the mood to talk, either, concentrating on his food. Kai was deep in thought, still struggling to come to terms with what he had learned from Effie and Jet. After a while, all 7 of them were more or less done with the meal. In the silence that followed, Effie glanced around the table. So. She leaned back and smiled. Is anyone going to explain what the hell happened in that damned city? Sunny looked at her somberly. So did Nephis and Mordred, the former without any emotion, the latter with a hint of amusement. At that moment, Jet stretched her legs, crossed them comfortably, and nodded. Yeah. Actually, I'm dying to know, too. Sunny remained silent for a few moments, trying to imagine the situation from their perspective, then sighed. Taking a sip of tea, he said. Well, first of all, our base assumption was wrong. We assumed that Twilight had been frozen in the middle of a battle between its army and the invading forces of the Defilement, but in fact, it was a battle between Soul Stealer and the Dread Lord all along. He paused, then added in a dark tone. They must have breached the walls of the city, which allowed Soul Stealer to consume the souls of everyone in Twilight. That was when he turned on the Dread Lord and tried to consume him, as well, and when the Mad Prince made use of the situation to activate the defensive array and trap them both. So, when I deactivated the array, both of those fiends were unleashed. Across the table from him, Cassie suddenly spoke. Some of us have a good chance of resisting Prince Mordred's power, but some don't. That was why you two had to be hidden from Soul Stealer. She turned slightly, facing Mordred. He smiled innocently. I don't like it at all. Sunny stared at the Prince of Nothing silently for a moment, then looked away. Don't worry. You don't have to be wary of him too much. We are currently allies, after all, and he knows that if something untoward happens, this nightmare will become his grave. The threat hidden in his words was not very subtle. But Sunny did not really worry about Mordred. There might have been something really wrong with that guy, but he was not a fool. The exact opposite, actually. He knew that harming any member of the cohort inside the tomb of Ariel would be a fatal mistake. Especially now, right after Soul Stealer had been destroyed by Nephis, Mordred would not risk making them all his enemies. At least not until the very last moment of the nightmare. Sunny sighed. In any case, pretty much as soon as the array was deactivated, Kai and I faced the Dread Lord. I had to use an enchantment of the Crown of Twilight to resist his commands, but at the cost of plunging into an uncontrollable rage. While the two of us fought against the dragon, Nephis and Cassie found themselves surrounded by the vessels of Soul Stealer. He paused. I am actually not too sure what happened next. Saying that, Sunny hesitated. He said that he did not know, but in truth, he did know something. Shimmering runes were glowing in the air in front of him. They read. Name, Nephis. True name, Changing Star. Rank, Ascended. Class, Titan. Soul Cores, 7/7. Soul Fragments, 7000/7000. Which was already startling enough. But there was something else near the end of the field of runes. Several new strings had appeared there. Those were the runes that truly gave him pause. Shifting his gaze slightly, Sunny read them once again. Aspect Legacy, Memory of Light. Aspect Legacy description, a beautiful tree grew from the ashes of doubt, bearing fruits of knowledge. Knowledge of fire, mastered. Knowledge of, unearned. Knowledge of, unearned. Knowledge of, unearned. Knowledge of, unearned. There were 7 strings in total, with only one of them revealed and described as mastered. So, whatever happened to Nephis in Twilight had not only allowed her to become a Titan, but also unlocked her Aspect Legacy. And that Aspect Legacy was more than a little bit strange, seemingly granting some sort of knowledge instead of relics. Sunny would lie if he said that he wasn't interested in learning what had happened. He looked at Nephis, hoping that she would explain at least something. She remained silent for a few moments, then shrugged indifferently. I tried to make my way to the palace, but Soul Stealer stood in my way. Facing defeat, I made a breakthrough and conceived of a new way of using my aspect, just like you had conceived of using yours to take shapes of powerful creatures. So, I used one of my soul cores as fuel and destroyed it to unleash a conflagration of soul flame. Sunny stared at her incredulously. On paper, what Nephis said made sense. He had indeed managed to deepen his understanding of his aspect and create techniques like Shadow Shell and Shadow Incarnation, thus becoming more powerful while remaining at the same rank. In a similar fashion, Nephis could have deepened her understanding and reached new heights of power. But there was a piece of the puzzle missing. So, your aspect allows you to burn your own soul and use it as fuel. But why was the explosion so immense and destructive? She looked at him impassively. My soul essence is especially potent, as you know. The explosion would have been devastating, regardless. But, yes, there was another element, as well. It was sorcery. Sunny raised his eyebrow, hiding how perplexed he was. Sorcery. Nephis nodded. Yes. The sorcery of names. I used the name of Wind to fan the flames burning across Twilight, and absorb them. Then, I ignited my soul, and whispered the name of fire. You saw the rest. In the end, all vessels of Soul Stealer were destroyed. The remnants of the defiled horde were destroyed, as well, allowing me to reform the Terror Core and form a new one. She paused for a moment. With nowhere else to run, Soul Stealer was forced to enter my soul. I burned him. Her even tone and motionless face made it seem as though destroying a corrupted Titan, millions of his puppets, and thousands of nightmare creatures in one fell swoop was nothing out of the ordinary. The rest of them stared at Nephis in stunned silence. In the end, Effie grinned. Good job, princess. Let's be friends, okay? Sunny was thinking about something else. Knowledge of fire. He had an inkling of what the knowledge Nephis had received from her aspect legacy was. It had to have contained the true name of fire, at the minimum, of every kind of fire there was, perhaps. It must have also elevated her already unmatched affinity to flame to entirely new heights. Nephis, meanwhile, looked at Effie with a hint of confusion in her striking grey eyes. Aren't we already friends? The huntress chuckled and raised her thumb up. Chapter 1526 Tempered in Flame. Nephis tilted her head, remained silent for a few moments, then said, I received a fair number of memories, too, sadly, not nearly as many as one would have expected, considering the death toll of the explosion. Still, there is at least one or two for each of us. We can distribute them later. With that, she turned to Sunny. That is what happened to Soul Stealer. What happened to the Dread Lord, though? How were the three of you able to kill him? He lingered for a bit. Cassie almost died in that explosion. Is Neff not concerned about that at all? A slight frown appeared on his face. Eventually, he grimaced and answered in a dark tone. Well, I already said that the Crown of Twilight allowed me to ignore his commands. That should have made things easier, since his most fearsome weapon was taken away. In practice, though, so was mine. My mind. Without being able to think straight, I was no better than a frenzied beast, worse, even, because even a beast would have used everything at his disposal to survive. He shook his head. But I was unwilling to summon my shadows, or work together with Kai to bring the Dread Lord down. That was unfortunate, to say the least. In the end, we ended up outside the city, in that floating fortress. I tied down the fiend, relentlessly attacking his body. That gave Kai an opportunity to destroy the amulet which had protected the bastard from Soul Stealer, and that gave Mordred an opportunity to attack his soul, in turn. Sunny glanced at Kai and smiled from the corner of his mouth. The Dread Lord was paralyzed for a few seconds, and our resident Dragon Slayer used those seconds to drive an enchanted arrow through his brain. That was how the three of us, but mostly Kai, managed to kill him. Kai had also prevented Mordred from taking possession of the Dread Lord's body, which would have undoubtedly given the Prince of Nothing ideas. Right now, he could be trusted not to turn on them because he needed Nephis to destroy the First Seeker. If Mordred had the power to subjugate her with the authority of the dragon's voice, though, who knew what he would have done? In hindsight, Kai's decision to not wait for the results of the soul battle might have saved them all. Sunny gave Mordred a somber look. Gods! How did I end up on the same team with that guy? Noticing his gaze, the Prince of Nothing smiled. Oh, I would have killed the Dread Lord myself. Probably. There was a little problem, you see, a seed of corruption somehow ended up blooming in my soul. Luckily, I managed to extricate the infected part and turn it into a reflection before the disease spread. So, I am back to being a mere beast. Alas! Now, it was time for them to stare at Mordred. What the hell? Who talked about becoming infected with corruption, cutting up their own soul, and turning the contaminated portion of it into an external entity in order to heal themselves? What insanity was that? Then again, perhaps Sunny wasn't the best person to accuse someone of insanity. He was currently living out the devious plan concocted by his past defiled self, after all. While he was contemplating whether any of the 7 people present on the mess deck could be called sane, Jet smiled and winked at Kai. Congratulations, Ascended Nightingale. Welcome to the club, the I Killed Myself Club? No, that doesn't sound right. Let's call it the Other Side Club. You know, 4 people who killed the other, evil version of themselves. She yawned lazily and summoned a wisp of mist, making it swirl around her fingers. So, did you unlock your aspect legacy, as well? Or at least received a powerful memory? Oh, you could have received an echo, even. Having an echo of yourself would be really weird, right? Everyone looked at Kai, imagining him having an echo of himself. He coughed awkwardly. No, I did not unlock my aspect legacy. Or receive a memory, or an echo. Actually, something strange happened. He hesitated for a moment. I seem to have received an attribute, instead. The Dragon Slayer attribute. I am not quite sure what it does. Sunny tilted his head, slightly bewildered. So, it's an actual attribute. What does the description say? Kai seemed to blush a little. You know, something about being forged in battle, tempered in flame, and quenched in dragon blood, stuff like that. Sunny stared at him incredulously. Well, damn. I bet the spell was generous on the compliments, too. In any case, Kai's new attribute had to have made his friend stronger. Considering the description, it most likely had something to do with durability and elemental resistance. Maybe there was a deeper layer to it, too. The truth would come out in time. Good, that was good. The cohort was finally assembled, and most of the members had already grown stronger. Nephis had received a collection of powerful memories, as well. Considering the strength of the nightmare creatures of the Defiled Legion, many of them would be of the transcendent rank. Sunny still had 5 supreme soul shards stored in the Covetous coffer, so he would be able to elevate some of those memories to the supreme rank, as well. The cohort would be ready to face Verge and Torment. The only plague that remained. Was that by accident, or the result of someone's intent? The will of the Mad Prince? Or Torment's own? Sunny did not know, but suspected that one of those two, or maybe even both of them, had harbored plans for Verge behind the Dread Lord's back. He sighed, then looked at Cassie and asked, not addressing anyone in particular. So, what's the plan now? Nephis answered immediately, no hesitation in her steady voice. What else? We sail for Verge, of course. Then, she turned to Cassie and asked, what is the fastest way we can get there? The blind girl hesitated for a moment. I'll have to check. She stood up and left, soon returning with a heavy crate. The stone slates they had recovered in the drowned temple of the defiled Sibyl were stored there. It took Cassie some time to lay the slates out on the table, reference them, and come up with an approximate route. In the end, she pointed to a particular slate. There, the shape of a graceful castle was etched. It seems that the fastest way to Verge is to simply sail downstream and keep going until we almost reach the dawn of time. However, the blind girl put 2 slates that did not seem to have anything in common together. With what we know about the shape of the Great River now, we can save a lot of time by simply crossing it, sailing past the western edge, and braving the inner void. That way, we should be able to bypass most of the journey into the past and land near Verge directly. A strange silence settled on the mess deck. Nephis studied the stone slates for a while, then nodded. This will take us close to Fallen Grace first. Let's stop there on the way, then, before departing for the final battle. She looked at them, her gaze lingering on Sunny for a few extra moments. Eventually, she said, if there is no objections. He might have been mistaken, but it seemed as though at least a hint of liveliness had returned to her voice. Well, the words liveliness and Nephis did not really go together, but it was a great relief to see that her humanity was slowly coming back. She was even interested in their opinions, his opinion, in particular. At least it seemed that way. Sunny sighed. What else is there to do? If we want to escape this nightmare, Verge in the only way. He shrugged. No objections from me. The others did not have any, either. After a few moments of silence, Nephis nodded. Onward to Verge, then. Chapter 1527 Leaving Twilight. The chain breaker left the drowning remains of Twilight behind and turned away from the rising suns. Drifting above the currents, it traversed the dreadful battlefield and escaped into clear waters. The great river flowed below them. By now, the sight of the world in constant motion was both familiar and calming. Sunny had a feeling that returning to reality, where the ground was solid and unmoving, would be a strange experience. There were no nightmare creatures in the vicinity of Twilight, so they could relax for a few days. The members of the cohort rested and recuperated, not doing anything in particular. They slept, consumed delicious meals, and spent their time in idleness. Even Mordred's presence did not dampen the peaceful mood. He was nothing if not accommodating, even pleasant to be around. Of course, true monsters knew better than anyone how to appear sympathetic and friendly, after all. And the Prince of Nothing was a singular existence even among the insidious monsters. But that was fine. Sunny did not mind sharing a ship with him, as long as Mordred was an ally. Gods knew that the cohort needed all the help it could get in this dreadful, utterly unreasonable nightmare. Sunny himself did not do much in the first few days of their journey across the Great River. He slept some more, spent some time staring at the sky, and chatted with Kai, describing the past events of the nightmare in more detail. The month he had spent with Nephis on the carcass of the Black Turtle, the battle with the Azure Serpent, their meeting with Ankh and the visit to Forlorn Weave, the journey to Fallen Grace and their reunion with Cassie, the battle against the defiled Sibyl, the dreadful months they had spent on Alethia's island, and their eventual escape. In the process, Sunny also spoke about the many mysteries they had solved and the startling revelations they had received in the tomb of Ariel. Looking back, he had truly learned a lot here, both about the past and the present. And about himself. Kai was the perfect audience for his outrageous tales. Sharing his experiences with a friend soothed Sunny's conflicted heart, a little. He was not quite all right, after suffering so much in Antarctica and on the Great River, how could he be? But he was at least back to being his usual spirited self. Almost. There was still the issue of what had happened at the end of Twilight to deal with. If there was a way to deal with that, even. Sonny felt that he at least owed it to himself to have a talk with Nephis, pointless or not. But with Nephis being in that strange dispassionate state, talking with her about deeply emotional issues did not seem like a good idea. She was slowly recovering, at least. So, Sonny decided to wait until she was back to her usual self before broaching the topic. With that, there was nothing for him to do. Eventually, the chain breaker traveled far away from Twilight. They were still bathed in the beautiful blaze of the endless dawn, but the waters the graceful ship was braving had imperceptibly changed. They were surrounded by danger once more. From here onward, there would be untold horrors hiding beneath the waves once more. The radiant sky would harbor terrifying abominations once more. And so, the members of the cohort would have to maintain vigilance at all times once more, ready to fight for their lives. The mood aboard the chain breaker subtly changed. That said, strangely, Sonny was not too concerned. Perhaps it was arrogance, but looking at the 7 people gathered on the graceful ship, he felt confident in their chances of at least reaching Verge unharmed. Had there ever been a more deadly cohort of masters? Surely not. Kai and Effie were veterans of both the Forgotten Shore and the Antarctic campaign, with plenty of incredible feats under their belts. Soul Reaper Jet was one of the most feared individuals in the world, with even saints being wary of her sinister blade. Cassie was someone whose lethality could not even be evaluated by mundane means. And then there were Sonny, Nephis, and Mordred. The 3 wielders of divine aspects, unheard of in history. Their individual power was already outside the scope of what masters were supposed to be capable of, and when put together. If anything, Sonny should have felt concerned for their enemies. Speaking of Mordred, Sonny had wished to avoid him entirely, but having access to the well of knowledge the Prince of Nothing possessed was simply too tempting. Granted, the bastard lied as easily as he breathed, so anything he said had to be taken with a grain of salt. In fact, as a rule of thumb, nothing Mordred said could be trusted. But Sonny still wanted to ask him a few questions, especially those that almost no one else could answer. Mordred could usually be seen at the bow of the chain breaker, where Saint stood guard with Morgan's warbow in her hands. He seemed to be very interested in the graceful stone knight, or maybe the bow she held. In any case, he could be found there most of the time. Sonny left his usual spot under the branches of the sacred tree, walked past Anan's Ketch, and approached the Prince of Nothing. Sensing his gaze, Mordred looked up. "Ah, Sunless. What a pleasant surprise. Did you want something?" Sonny glared at him for a few moments, then sighed and summoned the shadow chair. Noticing it, Mordred raised an eyebrow, as if remembering something unpleasant. "Oh." Sitting down, Sonny remained silent for a bit, then said evenly, "Yeah, I did want something. Just to chat for a bit." He glanced at Mordred and asked, trying to keep his tone devoid of hostility, "So, how is Ravenheart treating you?" The Prince of Nothing gave him a curious look. "Ah, you know. The weather is not great, but the people are really charming. Well, you've met Seishan and Beastmaster, so you must have an idea. It's like I'm living in a flower garden." Sonny smiled, nodded, and asked cordially, I see, so, what are the sovereigns up to? Are they really going to abandon the waking world?" Chapter 1528 New Eden. Mordred studied him with a neutral expression. Then, he smiled pleasantly. "How should I know? Am I a sovereign?" Sonny stared at him silently for a few moments. Eventually, he shook his head. "No, but you are a son of one, was raised by another, and currently serve the third. If you don't know, then who would?" Mordred laughed. "Well, if you put it like that, it does sound like I should know. However, Sunless, you seem to be mistaken about something. The thing is, I don't care to know. Why should I care about the waking world? Whatever happens to it has little to do with me." Sonny frowned. Indeed, Mordred had spent most of his childhood in the dream realm, so he had little attachment to Earth. More than that, he was not someone who would care about the lives of hundreds of millions of innocent people, let alone feel inclined to do something to save them. All Mordred cared about was his revenge against the great clan Vaylor. A faint smile appeared on Sonny's face. "Sure, you might not care about the waking world. But you do care about your father's plans, at least as far as to be able to try and ruin them better. So cut the crap and just tell me what you know. If you don't mind." Mordred stared at him with amusement for a while, then sighed and shook his head. Well, why not? But I'm afraid that you are overestimating me. I really do not know what my father and the Queen of Worms are planning. I am not exactly on speaking terms with the former, and the latter does not trust me enough to share such secrets. All I know is that they are serious about having a war with each other. That was why I joined Qi Song. He lingered for a moment and added, his voice losing its usual light-heartedness. I'll warn you, though. Don't presume to understand the sovereigns, Sunless. You might think that you have them figured out, but you don't. They are far older than we are, and far more powerful. They are also not some cardboard villains. My father, Qi Song, and the third one, are the most exceptional individuals of their generation, or maybe even of all generations. They did not end up on their thrones by accident. Sunny looked at him somberly. What are you trying to say? Mordred shrugged with a smile. I'm just saying that you might find it hard to understand their plans. Abandoning the waking world? Well, that surely sounds like something they would do. But if you think about it, why would they do that? Even if the sovereigns only care about the dream realm, they still need Awakened to populate it. And Awakened cannot exist without mundane people. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and you can't get a stable supply of eggs without a poultry farm. Something like that. Sunny remained silent for a while, thinking about what Mordred had said. Although the terms he used were very cynical, the underlying message held true. Indeed, there had to be an immense population of mundane people for a comparatively small amount of Awakened to emerge. If the waking world was indeed destined to be consumed by the dream realm, the sovereigns could not allow themselves to abandon it completely before that happened. Which went against what Sunny had learned about them before. He frowned, feeling confused. Eventually, Sunny shook his head and asked, his voice somber. What about the third one? Asterion, what does he want? As soon as those words were spoken, Mordred's smile dimmed, growing strangely forced. He leaned forward slightly. Sunless, do me a favor, try not to speak that name aloud. Otherwise, he might actually hear you. Sunny blinked a couple of times, staring at him incredulously. Come on. Really? Mordred let out a long sigh, then shook his head reproachfully. I'm not saying that to scare you, I'm just telling the truth. The old man, his powers are a bit beyond comprehension. If you feel threatened by Qi Song or my father, wait till you meet him. Better yet, hope that you never will. Sunny leaned back, crossing his arms. What's so scary about him? If he's so powerful, why isn't he participating in this war Song and Vela started? Where is he? Come to think of it, where does he come from? There is almost nothing written about him in the history books. Is he a legacy? Does he have a clan? An army? Mordred shrugged. The thing you need to understand about him is that his domain is different from those of the other two. Yes, domains can be different in nature. Most are like what my father and Qi Song possess, territorial. That is why Vela and Song are fighting over territory. But not his is more of an idea than a place. He remained silent for a few moments, then said somberly, you must have realized by now that the great clans were built by those who inherited the divine lineages. Vela was born from the lineage of war, Immortal Flame from the lineage of sun, House of Night from the lineage of storm. Clan Song rose to prominence later, after Qi Song discovered the lineage of beast. The old man is the one who has the lineage of heart, however, there is no clan he belongs to. Do you know why that is? Sunny shook his head. The lineage of Heart God. Heart God was also the god of souls, as well as emotions, memory, hunger, and growth. What kind of aspect could Asterion possess, then? What powers did he wield? What was the nature of his domain? Mordred took a deep breath, then smiled. Well, it's because he does not come from the legacy clans. Legacy clans have been in power since before we were born, so we are conditioned to assume that it has always been like that. But, in fact, there were many powers competing for the right to shape the world as they saw fit, back in the chaotic time after the spell first descended. Some more terrible than others. The old man is the last remnant of one of those vanquished powers. Sunny remembered hearing about that. From what he knew, the current system, with the government and the legacy clans maintaining the world order together, was established after several other, fringe factions had been defeated by the first legacies. Even with all the sins of the current regime, the ones that could have been would have been much more terrifying. At least that was what he had been told by Professor Obel. Mordred lingered for a moment. Ah, by the way, the old man is not that old, actually. It's just what I call him. The faction he comes from, you see, was a small group of the Path of Ascension zealots. Real fanatics, far more extreme than anyone you could have met among the legacies. Now, those people, they were really in favor of abandoning the waking world completely, believing that the nightmare spell was meant to pave the way for a new beginning. That the dream realm was a wild garden meant for a new breed of humans. He shook his head. And they did abandon the waking world, establishing an isolated colony in the dream realm not long after the first masters ascended. The man who would one day become the third sovereign was actually born there. In fact, he was the first human child born in the dream realm. The original dream spawn. Mordred smiled. Well, in any case, those reclusive extremists did not last long. Their colony was eventually overtaken by nightmare creatures, and he was the only one who survived. In the end, he found his way to Bastien, met my father, was brought back to the waking world, and joined Broken Sword's cohort. The Prince of Nothing looked at Sunny with a strange expression, then frowned. I hope that satisfied your curiosity. All this talking made me thirsty. I think I'll go find myself something to drink. He rose and moved to walk away, but then lingered for a moment. Looking back, Mordred said in a friendly tone. Oh, by the way. I said before that you'd better hope to never meet that guy. Sorry, I don't think you'll have a choice. The old man, you see, is very interested in people with divine bloodlines. Considering your connection to Shadow, the only missing lineage, he'll probably come find you someday. Your precious changing star, as well, since there might not be another Dreamspawn anywhere in the two worlds. With that, he smiled pleasantly and walked away, leaving Sunny alone. The chain breaker continued moving west, the leaves of the sacred tree rustling gently in the wind. Sunny stared silently at the vast expanse of the great river, his head full of dark thoughts. Goddamn it. It was really unfair. He did not even have the lineage of Shadow God, Bloodweave had greedily devoured it a long time ago. Why did he have to deal with a mysterious and sinister sovereign? It was not as if Sunny did not have a host of other terrible problems he had to deal with already. Mordred might have been lying, as well. It was only then that Sunny thought back on their conversation and uttered a quiet curse. The Prince of Nothing had talked for so long, but did not give a straight answer to a single question. That bastard. Chapter 1529 Worm of Doubt. The conversation with Mordred left Sunny in a somber mood. The bastard clearly knew more than he had deemed necessary to share, but the few pieces of information he did offer were concerning. However, Sunny did not dwell on the distant threat of the sovereigns for long. He did not have the luxury of worrying about something waiting far in the future when there were lethal dangers waiting for him in the present. Or past, technically, considering that Verge was situated far downstream, as close to the source and the estuary as the Seekers of Truth had been able to build it, before the defilement was born. Not long after he talked with Mordred, the chain breaker was attacked for the first time since leaving Twilight. The cohort dealt with the swarm of the drowned with comparative ease, allowing him to collect a few soul shards and forge yet to replenish her reserves of essence. After that, they maintained a battle-ready schedule at all times. Sunny's Shadow stood guard at different points of the ship day and night. Nephis and Cassie took turns steering the graceful vessel, keeping it at low altitude, sometimes just above the flowing water. Jet, Crow and Kai scouted ahead for signs of approaching danger. The most useful scout, however, was none other than Mordred. With his ability to perceive the world through reflections and the vast expanse of water around them, he could see far and wide, warning them of any suspicious movement far in advance. They did not have to fight too often. Sometimes, danger came from below the water, and sometimes, it came from the sky. But most of the time, the great river remained calm and peaceful, leaving them with plenty of free time on their hands. Knowing that the cohort was drawing closer and closer to the inevitable attack on Verge with each passing day, Sunny threw himself into weaving. There was a lot for him to do. He had 5 supreme soul shards, which meant that 5 of the transcendent memories the cohort possessed could be potentially elevated to a higher rank. The first thing Sunny had to do was choose what memories to alter. He chose the first 2 rather quickly. They were the transcendent armors Effie and Kai had received in the second nightmare, the former after slaying the Sun Prince, the latter after slaying the Ivory Lord, Dragon Sevirox. Both were potent and possessed tremendously robust weaves, making the possibility of the alterations damaging or destroying them slim. Best of all, they were memories of the first tier, so a single soul shard was enough to change their rank completely. The third memory Sunny decided on was somewhat of a harder choice. It was the transcendent weapon of the 7th tier Nephis had received for slaying Soul Stealer. The weapon, which could take many forms, possessed several insidious enchantments. In a sense, it was similar to the Cruel Sight, but much more versatile, destructive, and potent. Because of the similarities between the two silver blades, Sunny had an easier time studying its weave. Therefore, he had a better chance of transplanting a new nexus. Sadly, transplanting 7 was currently beyond his abilities, not that he had enough Supreme Soul Shards. However, Sunny decided to attempt isolating a single enchantment and supplying that enchantment alone with the power equal to that of a supreme memory, thus creating a strange and unheard of memory of a hybrid rank. The enchantment he chose was responsible for channeling elemental damage, as well as protecting the blade from harm. Considering Neph's propensity for destroying her memories with her own flame, or simply by exposing them to too much punishment, that single improvement would serve her very well in the future. The remaining 2 memories he decided to alter had also been received by Nephis in Twilight. Both of them were of transcendent memories of the 1st tier. One was an arrow, while the other was a charm. The arrow possessed a simple enchantment that enhanced the force delivered by its impact, and could also shape that force into a flat, severing field. The charm was a more complicated one, and served to enhance the material properties of other objects, making weapons sharper, armor more durable, and so on. With that arrangement, 2 of his companions would be better protected, 2 would be capable of delivering more harm to the enemy, and 1 would be able to better support the rest of the cohort in any kind of situation. With his plan set, Sunny began the work, studying the weaves of the chosen memories in great detail, creating threads of shadow essence, and preparing himself for the alterations was going to take him a long while. He hoped to be done with the process by the time they reached Fallen Grace, and if that failed, then at least before they reached Verge. Days passed with him being completely concentrated on the task. Strangely enough, studying the unfamiliar weaves also gave him some inspiration for his own unrelated project, the complicated puzzle of turning the covetous coffer into a semblance of an echo. For a while, Sunny was fully engrossed in the mysteries of weaving, not paying attention to anything else, except for occasional attacks on the chain breaker. Slowly, however, a note of dissonance invaded his focused mind. Sunny was reluctant to pay it much attention at first, but with each passing day, the worm of doubt that had entered his mind continued to grow harder to ignore. Especially because the Sin of Solace did not miss any opportunity to remind him of that small contradiction. The thought gnawing at Sunny's mind was a seemingly innocent question. How did Cassie survive the explosion that consumed Twilight? At first, he had not paid that detail any attention, simply being glad and relieved that the blind girl was alive. But the more time passed, the more it bothered Sunny, for some reason. Except for Mordred, who had been sent back to his physical body, all members of the cohort had been thrown out of the mirror realm in approximately the same location, past the open space where they had met Soul Stealer, near the inner districts of the city. From there, Nephis had made her way to the palace. Cassie, however, had somehow ended up near the gates of the city when the explosion happened. She then dove deep into the still water beyond the gates to save herself, as well as Effie and Jet, from the obliterating blast. But how had she found herself all the way near the Wall of Twilight? It had to have been immensely difficult to fight her way through the flood of Soul Stealer's vessels and the remnant abominations of the defiled horde. The distance between where the cohort had found themselves and the outer limits of the city was much greater than the distance to the palace. Cassie couldn't have reached the water by accident. So how had she done it? There was only one reasonable answer. It was that Cassie's goal had always been to escape the city, which meant that she had known what would happen all along. Chapter 1530 Blessing of Misfortune. Audiobook by the Nut Lord. All text belongs to the original author. Please support them online. This fan project is non-profit. Join the Discord for more audiobooks, and comment any mispronunciations so I can fix them. Sunny was restless. Cassie had survived, which brought him indescribable joy. He would have been broken if she had perished in Twilight. Nephis would have never forgiven herself for causing the death of her best friend, either. Not to mention that Effie and Jet would have been killed, as well, making the heartbreaking tragedy simply unbearable. So, it was the epitome of wonderful that Cassie had survived. But how had she survived? He did not know. It was close to impossible for her to be driven all the way to the limits of the city by accident. Which meant that she had fought her way there on purpose. Which meant that she knew what would happen. Which was also impossible. Not even because Cassie would have shared such precious information with them, allowing the cohort to come up with a better plan, but simply because she was not capable of perceiving the past and the future in the tomb of Ariel. She had told them so herself. All Cassie saw in her visions, ever since entering the nightmare, was darkness. That was what saved her from sharing the fate of the Sybils, who had all been defiled by the visions of the estuary. Here in the tomb of Ariel, Cassie was blind to the future and the past. That was her saving grace. She could not have known what would happen in twilight. Otherwise, she would have been defiled, and she wasn't defiled. Sonny knew that because he could see Cassie's soul, and because she was still a carrier of the nightmare spell. And yet she had to have known, somehow. It made no sense at all. Confused, he even remembered the eerie and nonsensical thought that had entered his mind after they escaped to Lethia's island. That Cassie could have been able to remember the previous cycles of the Great River, just like the Mad Prince had. Which would make her torment. But she couldn't be torment for the same reason. If she was, Sonny would have been able to see the darkness of corruption in her soul, and the spell would have banished her from itself. The strange incongruity gnawed at him more and more with each passing day. The only reasonable explanation was that fate had played a trick on them. It was almost impossible for Cassie to have found herself near the gates of twilight when the explosion happened, but only almost. She must have gotten incredibly lucky. Sonny was no stranger to witnessing extremely improbable events. His entire life was full of them due to his fated attribute. This time, they must have received a blessing of fortune. There was no other sensible way to explain what had happened. And still, he was restless, plagued by doubt. It was to the point that Sonny was having trouble concentrating on weaving. He found himself glancing at Cassie furtively when she was nearby, and then felt ashamed for doubting one of his companions. Not to mention that it was absolutely useless to try and spy on the blind girl secretly, because she could have been watching the world through his eyes, and would be aware of him looking at her. In any case, Cassie seemed to be perfectly normal. Well, as far as the word normal could be applied to her. She was mostly quiet, but not alarmingly so. She usually kept to herself, but not to the point of avoiding others on purpose. Usually, she would take her turn controlling the chain breaker, then descend below deck to rest when Nephis replaced her on the steering oars. When they were attacked, she participated in the battles, supporting the cohort from behind and stepping forward if there was a need. When everything was calm, she rested and went about her usual duties of maintaining the ship. Of course, Sonny did not know what she was doing when nobody was watching. How could he? Well, actually, he could. Spying on the blind seer was not an easy matter, considering that she could see through the eyes of the potential spy and knew their every move. However, as far as Sonny knew, while Cassie could use her ascended ability on the members of the cohort, she could not do the same with his shadows. She could also see through his eyes, if she wished to, but she could not see what he saw through the shadows. So, if he wanted to, he could send one of the shadows to observe the blind girl, just in case there was something strange going on with her. However, he wasn't sure that it was an appropriate thing to do. Sonny was very peculiar about trust. It had taken him a long time to gain the ability to trust others, so he cherished it greatly. Being able to trust, and receiving trust in return, those were intangible, but precious things. So, even if sending a shadow to observe Cassie would do the blind girl any harm, he would be breaking trust with her. Their relationship was complicated and tumultuous, and they had endured a lot together to repair it. He was reluctant to jeopardize that relationship. But the sin of Solace kept whispering into his ear, fanning the flames of Sonny's paranoia. In fact, the Sword Wraith did not whisper, but was incredibly loud with his insidious accusations and insinuations, especially so when Cassie was nearby. She never reacted, which made it seem as though she was unable to hear the odious apparition. Or was pretending to not hear it masterfully. Just think about it rationally. It was hard for Sonny to be dispassionate when it came to Cassie, but this time, he had to be. We only made it this far because of Cassie. But if I remove our friendship from the equation, she has indeed been behaving strangely. And there are certain things about her actions that can be seen as suspicious, if a stranger evaluates them. Which did not mean that they really were suspicious, just that they could be. Lowering all 6 of his hands, which had been weaving strings of shadow essence, Sonny frowned. In the end, it all comes down to a simple question. Do I want to be polite, or do I want to be safe? Seen in that light, his dilemma had a definitive solution. It was much better to be safe than sorry. After shaking his head, Sonny secretly sent one of his shadows to keep an eye on Cassie. He was almost entirely certain that he would not discover anything concerning. But at least the little part of him that had been restless and concerned was calmed by that precaution, allowing him to return to his tasks with an easy heart. He continued weaving. Chapter 1531 Colors of the Sky. With his mind at ease, Sunny was able to get back to weaving. Due to the crown of twilight, he did not have to worry about running out of essence, and created threads of it with increasing speed. The sight of him sitting all by himself, moving two sets of shadows' hands in addition to his own pair, must have been extremely strange, especially because his companions could not see the tenebrous strings wrapped around his many fingers. But they were long used to the strange things Sunny did from time to time, so he was mostly left alone. The chain breaker sailed duskward, slowly leaving the waters of endless dawn behind. At the same time, Sunny was observing Cassie. The blind girl did not do anything suspicious, assuaging his fears. Despite the poisonous accusations the Sin of Solace kept spouting into his ears, she was perfectly normal. Cassie spent half of the day steering the flying ship, then went about mundane tasks or rested in her cabin. She maintained a calm and friendly demeanor while spending time with the other members of the cohort, albeit remaining slightly aloof. Cassie had become rather taciturn at some point, but it was not as if she was reticent and went out of her way to not participate in any conversations. It was just that she seemed content to listen quietly, most of the time, only voicing her opinions when there was a reason. When Cassie was alone, she remained composed and collected. There was not much to do on the peaceful days, but she was seldomly idle. Without anyone noticing, the blind girl had taken it upon herself to maintain the ship in pristine condition. Others had joined her belatedly, sharing the chores and menial tasks while chattering and joking. The atmosphere on the wash decks of the chain breaker was harmonious and tranquil. Cassie was only alone when she retreated to her cabin to sleep. Sunny felt more than a little bit weird, guilty, even, when sending his shadow to spy on the blind girl there. Of course, he made sure to look away when needed, so as not to see anything improper. But still, it was a strange situation. Luckily, Cassie was not doing anything to give credence to the insinuations made by the Sin of Solace. The only peculiar thing Sunny discovered was that she had developed the habit of keeping a diary, at some point. The blind girl had brought a leather-bound journal with her when they departed Fallen Grace, and was diligently leaving short notes on its pages before sleep. Sunny did not really want to read what she wrote, though. He wouldn't have been able to read the journal even if he wanted to, anyway, not because Cassie did anything to make it hard for someone to gain access to it, but simply because she wrote in Braille. Apart from the leather-bound book, she had also brought a special slotted slate. The slate, which had probably been specially made for her by an artisan in Fallen Grace, consisted of two parts connected by a hinge. By opening the slate, Cassie could place a sheet of paper inside, and then poke holes in it with a stylus by following the slots. Because of how proficient Cassie was with handling her floor, it was sometimes easy to forget that she was blind. But her aspect abilities might have allowed her to negate some of the most debilitating sides of her condition, but the underlying cause remained. When Cassie was alone, she could not borrow someone's vision to see the page. Her ability to sense what would happen a few moments into the future could not help her see the path of ink on paper, either. So, in these private moments, she could only use such a method to read and write. Separated from her by several bulkheads and the mass of the upper deck, Sunny looked away from the shimmering spellweave and gazed at the beautiful sky above him. It was painted with a million vivid colors, rays of sunshine falling through the radiant clouds. The leaves of the sacred tree moved gently, making the tapestry of shadows etched into the wooden surface of the deck shift. Looking down, he sighed quietly, and returned to his task. Days passed slowly. Eventually, they left the reaches of the great river where dawn never ended. The sky gradually brightened, turning vast and perfectly blue. The nights were longer here, with water glowing softly in the absolute darkness of the absent stars. As the great river changed, the people sailing across its endlessly flowing surface changed, as well. Kai finally did not seem disoriented anymore, having come to terms with the bizarre and incredible truth of the third nightmare. He quietly trained and prepared himself for the nearing battle, perhaps feeling remorseful about not sharing the hardships his friends had endured. Jet was practicing and experimenting with her mist blade, capturing new souls every time the chain breaker was attacked. She was slowly figuring out how to use her deadly weapon to achieve truly harrowing results, which sometimes chilled even her allies. Effie's belly was slowly growing. She spent most of her time helping the